I'm very excited to have with us today Kate Pullinger. Kate is an innovator, creator, an author, an award winner, and a professor. She is one of the most innovative and accomplished people in publishing. She writes for both print and digital platforms. She's the winner of the Governor's General Literary Award, one of Canada's most prestigious literary prizes. She's an accomplished novelist, and her new novel, Forest Green, is a story about a logger who works in the forests of British Columbia. It came out in 2021. She's equally amazing at innovative digital publishing projects. In May 2021, she won the Marjorie Lusbrook Career Achievement Award, given every year by the Electronic Literature Organization. Her most recent digital fiction project, Beathe, is a ghost story that knows where you are. It's available for free on your phone. It was shortlisted for the New Media Writing Prize in 2019. Kate is also a professor of creative writing and digital media at Beathe University, where she's also director of the Center for Research in the Cultural and Creative Industries. And she's currently academic lead on Amplified Publishing, looking at the future of publishing. So Kate, thank you so much for taking time to speak today to our class. There are so many things that we could talk about. You have a really remarkable and unique background. Let's start a little bit about your personal journey. In particular, what led you to becoming not only a successful novelist, but also an innovator of born digital works that are really unlike traditional print literature, as well as an innovation strategist. It's not a stretch, I think, to say an entrepreneur.
Oh, thanks, John. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I guess for me personally, one of the qualities that I think lots of writers share is a kind of magpie interest in things, sort of going for the shiny bits and things that are appealing on the surface. So I've always written since I was a child, and I started publishing fiction in my 20s, which is a long time ago now. But I had about a decade that I spent thinking about writing for film and television. And during that period, I had one drama that got made and broadcast. But it kind of coincided with the early days of the internet. And I began to feel that the internet was actually a really interesting space for storytelling. So I gradually sort of shifted my attention away from what was then the static TV screen, over to the computer screen, which seemed to me, had much more potential for interactivity and for kind of real experimentation of the kind that I was drawn to. So that was around the turn of the millennium, so 20 years ago or so, and it just I started teaching a bit online. I started experimenting a bit online, and I became aware of it as just a kind of an avenue for really interesting thinking and work, away from the kind of commercial pressures of the film and TV industry, and kind of more in keeping, in a strange way, with my life as a novelist. That business of sitting on your own and trying to conjure up a story that my work as a novelist is really dependent upon.
Thanks. So picking up a little bit more on that, what do you think are some of the qualities and personal interests and capacity and especially strengths that have helped you launch successful new digital initiatives in particular? And do you feel that the strengths that you need to succeed as a novelist are quite different than the strengths you need as a digital innovator, or are they similar in your case?
Well, I think the thing that they have in common is an interest in thinking about how to tell a story and new ways to tell stories in the case of the digital. But I think the key difference is that the work that I do in the digital sphere is always collaborative. Highly collaborative, like from day one collaborative, whereas writing a novel is not collaborative until you start engaging in the publishing, the publishing end of it, which in terms of writing a novel is really the end stage. So that is one of the things that I figured out when I first started working online was I wasn't going to become a programmer. I wasn't going to become a website designer. So if I was going to work in that realm, I would have to find collaborators. And that has remained one of the things that I really love about working in the digital sphere is the way that it is for me so highly collaborative. Usually quite small teams, but even so, just, you know, I really love that back and forth, partly because of the contrast that it provides with this really solitary business of writing prose fiction. So the two things really kind of spring off each other for me.
Yeah, very interesting. So we'll talk a bit more about collaboration in a minute. I first got to know you and your work through Inanimate Alice, which it's a transmedia story originally published in 2005. Can you briefly tell us about that project, especially lessons that are applicable to publishing entrepreneurship? In particular, maybe what can we learn about the intersection between experimentation and innovation and business model considerations and constraints?
Well, I guess in some ways, the beginning of Inanimate Alice was a lesson in how not to do things. Just in that, you know, back then, it was a kind of wide open field. There was very little of the kind of accessible storytelling that I think Inanimate Alice exemplifies online. Obviously, there's a huge amount happening in the game sector, which is slightly which is really adjacent. I was more interested in the kind of almost what happens with literature when you try to make it interactive and put it on a screen. So we embarked on that really without knowing anything about who our audience would be. And of course, you know, from an entrepreneurial point of view, you always got to know who your audience, who's your market, is there a gap in the market? And we didn't think about that at all, even to the extent to which it didn't really occur to us that the fact that we were writing a story about a child would be appealing to children. we didn't even get that far. But luckily we kind of cottoned onto that fairly quickly once we started working on the series, and really very quickly realized that there was a really engaged audience of teachers in particular who were really keen on Inanimate Alice because it was because you could use it in the classroom. And even now, 15, 16, 17 years later, there's a real dearth of fun, exciting content for the classroom that is multimedia, interdisciplinary, and engages kids. I think one of the things that Inanimate Alice managed to do was it appeals to both sophisticated young readers and young readers who are reluctant to read because of the games element in it. It kind of can bring in both ends as well as everybody in the middle.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I know it's had a lot of appeal of educators really around the world, you know, and I understand that it's been used in, you know, in colleges as well, you know, in like new media classes and media literacy and stuff.
But of course, the problem with it was that there was never really a good business model for it, and that remains the case today, and in a way even more so with the rapid rise of high quality visual media content that people can access for free online. It's the business model is really difficult.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your most recent, relatively recent project, Amplified Publishing. This sounds really interesting. I know you're a co-investigator on this and I think academic lead. So this is a research effort to examine and propel the potential challenges, opportunities, and potential in publishing, and as part of a UK-based incubator, Bristol and Bath Creative, R&D. Can you give us a little bit of background on how you got involved in this incubator project, Amplified Publishing, and its overall goals?
Yeah, so one of the things that is interesting about the Bristol and Bath region is that it's part of west of England for those of you who have never been to England. And it's got real strengths in the publishing sector more broadly. And so it's part of a larger research project where we've looked at kind of how technology is impacting the creative industries. So we had one strand that was called digital placemaking, which looked at that whole range of what's going on in the world. And then another called expanded performance, which specifically looked at the impact of digital technology on live performance, from theater to music, etc. And so Amplified Publishing was our third project. And it just seemed like there was real strengths in the region, but also I guess it also partly comes out of my own sort of frustration that kind of innovation in the I guess what, for want of a better word, kind of mainstream traditional publishing sector has really focused around digital workflows and not so much around innovation around content. And that's been an ongoing kind of puzzle to me. So the project partly arises out of my own interest in that, and also my interest in the way that different sectors like the games industry, how will it influence the publishing industry, and how will the publishing industry influence the screen-based industries, etc. So trying to create an interdisciplinary research project.
Yeah, that's something that really interests me as well, and also like you, it kind of puzzles me that there hasn't been more innovation on the creative side, on the publishing side. But I think we'll get there eventually, and this is something that's really interesting in the sense that it's propelling that. So you recently shared some information about the first 3 projects that received funding through Amplified Publishing, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about these 3. So there's Lost Horizon, Follower TV, and Stormjar, and they all hope to, I'm quoting from the website, enable creators to generate sustainable income streams, find new audiences, and innovate through the creative and ethical use of technology. I like the ethical part in there too. Can you talk a little bit about each one, especially through the lenses of entrepreneurship and publishing?
Yeah. I mean, for me, one of the great things about these 3 prototype projects that we've decided to fund is that they really do focus on creators, community, and commerce in quite interesting ways. So Follower TV is one of those projects that's, when you hear about it, it's like, why has nobody done that before? So it will enable a creator to draw together all their content online into a single chronological feed. So if you follow, I don't know, some TikTok star, and you know that they also produce content on Instagram, and they also have a blog, and maybe they're involved in a podcast, you can follow them on Follower TV, and all their content will appear chronologically for you as an audience member to access. And the creator in turn can also make sure that all their content is showing up on Follower TV. So that's the basic concept of it. And what we're hoping it'll do is enable creators to talk to their audiences across all those platforms. Because going back to the example of the TikTok star, it's often the case that they'll have, I don't know, I'm pulling random numbers, but 1 million followers on TikTok and only 50,000 followers on Instagram. And why is that? And what can they do to make sure that their audience is seeing what they're doing? And behind that, there's a commercial model around targeted adverts and what you're actually looking at. So these are still, the money has only just been awarded. So if I sound a bit vague about some of it, that's why. So that's follower TV. Lost Horizons is really interesting. Another big feature of the Southwest, the west of England, is music festivals. It's got a long history of huge music festivals, the most famous of which is Glastonbury. So the people behind Lost Horizons used to have a big part of Glastonbury every year where they'd do immersive theater performances. So when the pandemic hit, they had to move online. And they created Lost Horizons as a way of bringing audiences into music festival experiences via 360 video and VR. And they've really been successful with that. And they're a very grassroots organization. When we were talking to them about their project, they described it as a punk metaverse. So, you know, we're all kind of cautious about the use of the word metaverse because it's becoming a corporate term. So we're really interested to watch them expand their audience and the way they work with audiences around the world with their content, which is largely at the moment musician driven. And they've already got a relationship with Twitch. So they've already started live because they have a venue in Bristol now. So they've already started live streaming from their venue. So we think there'll be some really interesting work that will enable creators to find new income streams through Lost Horizons.
And Stormjar sounds really interesting too. Yeah.
Stormjar is the one that's hardest to explain. So it's a community. It will be a community for people who write horror fiction, with the idea that that you can auction your nightmares, and what they want to use is a sustainable version of NFTs, so that if you're posting fan fiction or horror fiction on their site, you can have micro attribution. So if you start a story, the fact that you started that story will be attached to the story. And then when I contribute to that story, my contribution will be attributed to me, attached to that story via NFTs. So don't ask me too many questions about that, because that's because there's a lot of people who insist that NFTs cannot be environmentally sustainable because they reside on the blockchain, whereas Stormjar and the research that they've done is saying kind of the opposite of that, that there is a way to create environmentally friendly NFTs that can be used for attribution. So we'll see.
There's another organization I'm involved with personally as a creator called Group Muse, and they're getting into that as well, NFTs for creation.
Is that for musicians?
About that.
Is that
for musicians?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my other side. Well, these are all really great. And the Stormjar, I mean, you mentioned that it's for horror fiction, but I could see that would easily translate to, like, I don't know, I have a couple students now that are doing like sci-fi fiction and you know, transhumanism and you know, all these types of genre fictions could maybe have some application for that. So it seems that it has a lot of application beyond, you know, just horror fiction.
Yeah, I agree. So it'll be, but I think they're clever to place it within the horror fiction community, because that's a very passionate community online, and so, you know, I think that hopefully they'll get a lot of engagement because of that.
Yeah, we talk a lot about niches in the program and in this class, and even like I use the term micro niche, and you know, you maybe have like horror fiction as a niche, but then like within that, there's all these different kind of, you know, I'm not personally in the horror area, but like there would be all these different micro niches of like really passionate and involved people.
Well, there's the whole area. There's the whole area online of creepypasta and all of that form of storytelling.
Oh yeah, I kind of heard of that a little bit. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your latest digital project that you did, Breathe. This is another really interesting one. This is this is a literary experience that's delivered through the smartphone, and it responds to your presence by internalizing the world wherever you are using APIs, which is of course application programming interfaces, to use the data surrounding you, including place, weather, time, in order to create an experience that's personal and uncanny. And this is actually not your first experience with APIs as well, because I know Landing Gear had that. Can you talk first a little bit about the collaborative aspects of this work between you and Ambient Literature, Visual Editions, and Google Creative Lab? And what did each partner bring to the table? And was it a challenge to have each partner accountable for their responsibilities and deliverables? I know you talked earlier about collaboration, so this is really important as a lesson for publishing and entrepreneurship.
That's one of the largest collaborators in terms of the team that I've ever been involved with, and that brings its own challenges. But I'm so proud of Beathe. I think it's it's really a project of mine that I'm really proud of and pleased with. So the Ambient Literature Research Project was a 2-year project that was trying to think about the interplay between where the reader is and the content that they're reading. So it was around the reader's situation and the context of the reader. So that project commissioned a series of creative works, one of which was Beathe. So they provided some of the funding for the project, and I was engaged with that. So that was kind of my research output for that project was Beathe. Visual Editions and Google Creative Labs were already collaborating on their project, which is called Editions at Play. Mm-hmm. They published a whole series of books for the smartphone. So there was Alan Trotter's work, which is about someone kind of losing grip of reality, which is reflected in the way that the story disintegrates as you're reading it on the phone. There was a big project called Seed that was a kind of very visually beautiful kind of using the metaphor of seed and growth and tying stories together through this kind of beautiful growing visual metaphor. So they'd already done probably maybe 8 or 9 projects before we started to work with them on Beathe. And a Google Creative Lab provided the kind of the programming behind Beathe. And Visual Editions were really instrumental in the kind of look and feel of the project overall. So yeah, it was a really interesting project to be engaged with, and as I said, I'm really proud of it. No business model again. When Editions at Play first launched with their first couple of books for the phone, they were selling them through it's Google Play, isn't it? Google
Play, yeah.
Yeah. But they stopped trying to sell things and just started offering things for free. And I think, during the collaboration, there was a lot of decisions that had to be made in order to create something that worked well. I was really interested in thinking about sound in the context of a ghost story, because Beathe is a ghost story. But they were very clear that they didn't think we needed sound, and that also using it's not an app, you get it through your browser on the smartphone. It's not a download. So of course, delivering multimedia via a URL is more difficult than in an app. So there was all these different factors that came into creative decisions as well. But at the end of the day, I think one of the strengths of Beathe is its bookishness. It does feel like a reading experience, even though you're reading on your phone, and even though the phone is pulling in data, and that data is influencing the story. So through the APIs, some of it is obvious, like the story knows where you are and will start to bring in locations that are close to you. And but a lot of it is not obvious to the readers. So it changes it'll change the season according to where you are. It'll be hot or it'll be warm. It'll change according to the time of day, like if it's morning or evening, etc. So all of that is much more subtle. So that process of collaborating with that quite big team was really interesting for me, and then resulted with this work that I'm really proud of.
Yeah, I'll be sharing it with the class for sure. Are there any plans for any kind of follow-up or sequel or some other project emerging out of that one, do you think?
Well, for me personally, yes, I don't know that team would come together again, because apart from anything else, Visual Editions have ceased trading.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they've kind of they drew a line, not because they weren't successful, just because the two founders decided that they wanted to move on.
Ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had some contact with them in the past, not recently though. They're very nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that Beathe does in a very small way is it asks the reader permission to use the reader's camera. And it takes one photograph and then uses that photograph in different ways throughout the story. So it seems to me that there's something really interesting there about the camera and the phone and the reader and where the reader is, and how that could be used for storytelling in other ways. That's one thing that we did in Beathe that I'd really like to explore further. But I'm also really interested in the future of reading. You know, as visual media becomes more and more dominant, as hopefully VR and AR and extended reality becomes better and more readily available, where will reading go in that context? Are any of those environments reading environments? Obviously the computer is, and the phone is as well. You know, they're decent places to read. But immersive environments, is anybody going to want to read in those?
That's a good question. I think possibly. Probably depends on the context, but I think reading certainly serves such a purpose that I think it always will have a use. I think that's a great question.
One that I'm really interested in exploring and thinking about further.
The example of the concert experience with virtual reality, potentially, like, you could read background information on the artist, or the artist wrote a story, or I don't know, who knows.
Yeah, and even kind of basic things like navigation and reading, well, as you say, background information, let alone immersive environments that use text for storytelling.
I would imagine that you are presented with and just find a huge number of projects and ideas that you could get involved with and spend your time and your mental energy. You seem to be involved nonstop in creation, but we all do need to sleep now and then. So do you have like a particular criterion that you use to evaluate potential projects? Do you have certain ways or tools that you use to prioritize?
I think quite a lot of it is gut instinct and whether something appeals or not. I do that continual kind of weighing up of the time that I want to spend on my own, just creating, just writing, and the time that I want to spend with other people collaborating. So that there's tension in there, but it's a good tension, really. And I think really it's when an opportunity comes along, just whether or not it's appealing, really. It's kind of as simple as that. One of the reasons that I work in academia now was because of the way in which, if you're lucky, an academic post can help support your creative work. And certainly when I first started working in academia about a decade ago, it was absolutely becoming more difficult to make a living, particularly as someone who writes books. so I'm always, I mean, one of the things I really like about working in academia is the way it brings you into new disciplines and new people. So my kind of the focus for me in my day job around digital innovation in the creative industries has been for me a really useful tool for thinking about my own creative projects in terms of what might be down the line in the future, if you see what I mean, John.
Mhm,
I hope that
mhm.
wasn't too garbled.
No, no, that's good. Yeah, it's interesting. And I believe in, intuition, trusting your gut instincts too. Sometimes like for myself, it's like a combination. Like I always try to trust my intuition, but like also verify, like, I don't know, we talked earlier about business models. In our course on publishing entrepreneurship, we're looking at different models of financing, including crowdsourcing. Can you discuss this funding aspect of amplified publishing and the incubator, Bristol, Bath, creative R&D? How does the funding model there work? And what have you learned overall as an author and innovator in different projects about funding these types of innovative publishing projects and funding companies?
Well, on the kind of research project end of thing, the funding comes through research councils, which is, so it's public money that's channeled into research and development, and that's been for me one of the great advantages of working with digital technology over the last 20 years is when it comes to the creative sector, there's much more research money available that revolves around digital technology and developing technologies than there would be if I just stuck to writing my novel, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So that for me, that's been both useful and really interesting. But I when I was thinking about the questions that you sent me in advance, I was thinking about entrepreneurship and about how for a large part of my career, I've been a freelancer, and I still have a freelance practice, obviously, and freelance income. But I think in the past, I would never have thought of that as entrepreneurship.
Mm.
And I don't really know why. I've been trying to think about it today. I think maybe it was because in the past, I think there was a bigger division between what was thought of as business and what was thought of as the arts.
Mhm.
And, a kind of ideological divide even. But I think that is something that has really changed in the last decade with the rise of the creator online and you mentioned crowdfunding, the whole world of Patreon, the whole world of people trying to find their audience online. And I think if I was in my 20s now, I would absolutely be really engaged with that notion of the creator as an entrepreneur, the writer as an entrepreneur, in a way that just wasn't spoken of when I was in my 20s. So I think that's a really interesting thing. I think it's both harsh because the world is harsh these days and it's really hard to find your way as a creator. But I also think, just disagree with myself that it's all, artists have always had to duck and dive and find, fund this by doing that and, whatever, sell your
It's
blood.
never been easy to be an
No, it's
artist,
never
has
been
it?
easy.
No. No, I mean, in a way, it's kind of the golden age, but I agree. It's like, it's very difficult. There's so much stuff out there and, but yeah, like all these funding model, crowdsourcing, it's wide open, but it's very difficult. I've talked to a few people in this course, particularly that have been successful at crowdfunding, but there's a lot of people that are not, and so.
Yeah, and I think I would still resist the idea of an individual writer or musician or artist or whatever having to become a brand, having to think of yourself and your creative output as a brand. Just, I find that depressing. And I don't know if that's an age thing or if it, I don't know, but interesting.
Well, I didn't have that as one of my questions, but I mean, that's a good thing, because I mean, I think, yeah, you don't want to primarily think of yourself as a brand, but I mean, you are a brand in a way. Like I know there are people, I follow you as a person, but I mean, certainly there's that brand, Kate Pullinger, and I mean, and you talked about this before, like I think you're kind of unique. You're not the only one, but like the ability to like be private and write and like spend your time on a novel, but also like collaborate on these projects. That's a fairly unique thing. You know, a lot of writers are very solitary people and not very able to collaborate. And then a lot of collaborators are not very good at the private, like getting a novel done, you know, so that's kind of unique. But I think of you definitely are like a brand, and you know, I'll share with everybody your website. Your website has like all your different projects and stuff. And I know there must be like people that, you know, will buy any book you publish and stuff. That's the kind of brand thing.
Yeah. No, it's a contradictory thing. But you know, it's certainly not something that I used to think about very much. You know, that
Sure.
business of who is my audience, finding my audience. I just wanted to write things.
Yeah. Well, so this brings us to the next question. I really don't want to ignore your kind of more traditional projects, because your novels are amazing. This isn't a writing class or even a writing program, but it's a publishing program. So what are some lessons that you've learned from the digital projects that you apply to your writing, or vice versa? And again, how do you balance these? And first of all, in terms of time and prioritization, like how do you balance this, or whatever you want to talk about the writing side from like a kind of entrepreneurship aspect, I guess?
Yeah. The thing about writing a novel is that it really takes a long time, but it's typical of me to have another project on the go at the same time, because of what I talked about earlier, the contrast between the two modes of working. You know, working with people as opposed to working by myself. I think one of the things that I've tried to find ways to bring into my traditional publishing are ideas from the digital, and that's still much more difficult than I thought it would be, and that's partly because, you know, the traditional publishing model, in many ways, just it works. So why do anything differently? And I had a conversation with the publicist on my novel Forest Green, in the run up to publishing, and we were talking about social media and all the things that you can do to promote a novel on social media. And so I said to her at one point, you know, do you know if any of this works? And her answer was no idea, because they have no way of tracking whether, you know, 50 people liking my tweet results in any book sales. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
there are some ways, but yeah, you're right. It's a kind of thing. But on the other hand, like, you know, not getting the word out certainly doesn't help it. You know, one thing, this isn't new, but I see like a new resurgence, or a new kind of rise in serialization. Like I'm sure you've been following things like Substack, and you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this whole rise of newsletters, you know, their subscription-based newsletter. Have you thought about you know, doing a novel as like a Dickens style serialization model? Have you thought of that at all?
Yeah, I continue to think about that, and I continue to be really curious about Substack and what's happening on there, and who's doing what in interesting and successful ways. And that is something I'd like to have a go at it at some stage. Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? Because there's only so many hours in the day, and
Right.
and there's, in a way, it stems back to what we were saying earlier. There's kind of multiple opportunities, but figuring out which of the opportunities that are going to work for you is the tricky one, isn't it?
Mm.
Over the weekend here, there was an interview with the American writer George Sanders in
Okay.
the Guardian, where he was talking about the fact that he's started a Substack, and that comes out of his teaching creative writing, and yeah, it's just really interesting to see the different models that people are working with, but at the same time as producing traditional print books.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think you really have a unique perspective because you've been successful at both print and digital publishing, which is not very common, really. Do you have any other further thoughts on the future of publishing, especially, but not necessarily only with entrepreneurship in mind? I know that's a huge question, but I know you're thinking about these things, and you already mentioned a couple, but any other thoughts kind of looking into the future, things that you'd like to get involved with or that you see as like opportunities?
I do spend some time lately worrying about the future of reading, actually, and in relation to traditional publishing, and how I'm not entirely convinced that traditional publishing is thinking very hard about younger audiences and more diverse audiences. I think, that there's a real question mark over that. And I was writing something recently where I was looking at all that research that's been done that shows that reading is good for you, where they stick a reader into an MRI and watch their brain do all kinds of interesting things. And that always seems a bit desperate to me. Like, you have to kind of shore up the pleasure of reading by referring to some science instead of just producing something that everyone wants to read. So that's a kind of thing I have on my radar, which also relates to my interest in text in immersive environments, text in new digitally enhanced environments. And I guess that comes out of my my lifelong love of reading and my knowledge of what that has given to me in terms of my own development and my own imaginative life. So I think that in terms of kind of entrepreneurship and business opportunities, it's really about trying to keep an eye on what's happening on the kind of outer margins of innovation, really. Probably not within the traditional publishing industry, but whether there's something happening in the games industry that you think could be tied into publishing in a significant way, or you see something in the music industry, or these industries.
I always follow the gaming industry, although personally I'm not a gamer really at all, but I don't spend time like on games, but I do find that intersection between publishing and gaming, I think, has some potential, not in the kind of shoot 'em up games, but like, I don't know, did you see that game, Wilder Myth? Did you see that one?
Oh, no.
I'll send you a link to that. Like, that's an example. I mentioned that in the article I sent you the other day.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's a really interesting one. There's a few of these. There's a company in the UK that's been doing some interesting text-based games. There's a few, but yeah, I think, one of the things that's really confusing is, for example, if you look at last year, I haven't seen like final reports about the publishing industry for 2021, but certainly in 2020, 2021, sales were really good for most publishers. Sales are like booming. But if you see like polls of how much people are reading is down. Like, people are reading less, but like buying more books. I think it's partly aspirational. Like, I don't want to read these new novels coming out, but then finding the time to concentrate and actually do it is a different thing.
Yeah, and I think I have seen some statistics that show that what people are buying is older books that are already really well known that they haven't read, as opposed to the front list. So that's an interesting phenomenon as well, isn't it? I mean, we live in
Yeah,
an absolute golden age of reading as well as a
right.
golden age of viewing, don't we? I mean, books have never been so widely available or so cheap.
And certainly, at least, from my perspective, I can see that there's still a lot of young people coming into publishing that want to be publishers, so I think
That's great to
that's a
hear.
good sign. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's wonderful to chat with you, and I hope we get a chance to see each other in person one of these days. But it's good to see you this way, and thank you so much for spending the time. And I really enjoyed the conversation. I know the students will too.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure it's a great class that you're running, John. So I hope
Thanks.
it goes well.